Now, example 2 on the next page simply comes from the Scots-Irish list, and I offer it simply because this woman who sent the message, she also sent me an article when I got permission to use it, is telling this fellow how to research his heritage, his genealogy in the various Irish databases. And this is an example then of the richness and the scope of the resources they have that give them access to all kinds of ways of respecting themselves, valuing their ethnonym, and giving them a sense of worth. Now, the third example, however, is the one I want to focus on a bit now. This demonstrates this genealogical system within a family narrative rather than a genealogical reckoning. Here, the pragmatic entailments to Scotch-Irish become very complex, and the valuation of the ethnonym more integrated into family and Revolutionary War history. I just think it's a great story for those of you who know anything about Ferguson. And it tells us about family relationships and local folk traditions. This conversational narrative relating a family story contains several key nouns that provide semantic and text-internal pragmatic links to the identifier Scotch-Irish. Ferguson denotes the loathed English Revolutionary War figure under discussion offered earlier by Dr. Edgar, who is a historian at the University of South Carolina, and he has the floor, of course, and is talking about his recent book. First, this passage entails academic discourse, such as referenced by Edgar, concerning white, specifically Scotch-Irish white contributions toward the success of the Revolutionary War and the formation of the United States. Such entailments therefore empower the speaker and her ancestors as having rights and access to American democratic polity. Secondly, the use of Ferguson entails other community and family-based narratives recounting the assessment of Ferguson in local history. It therefore bonds this discourse to other white narratives and conversations familiar to those in the local audience, creating a group based on shared historical experiences. In addition, and I will be exploring this much further in the future, this segment introduces a kin term, my great-grandmother, who was a Scotch-Irish cotta. These phrases link kinship and ancestry to a surname, which in turn is modified by the ethnonym Scotch-Irish. Here, white ancestry is unambiguously associated with genealogy that can be reckoned back to Ulster by entailments created by the use of the name cotta and all of the family connections it has contemporaneously and historically. It also allows them to link Scots-Irish and cotta into other kinds of discourse, including religious and military and educational, into the Bible with its begats, and all of that kind of sacred legitimation of who they are. Now, the narrative itself recounts a presumed truthful set of events traced through family lines for over 200 years. The event of a Scotch-Irish family throwing stones on the grave of a notable historical figure becomes thick in Clifford Geertz's sense in its historical depth and its linkage to specific ancestors traced genealogically as worthy, valued individuals. Furthermore, possessive constructions, such as my great-grandmother, function in part to link the speaker to this past through the deictic functions of the possessive pronoun. The autonomous self of the speaker becomes merged into the deeds of her ancestors through the inalienable attributes of kinship and merged in the group around her because she is co-present in that event, and the my as a shifter is actually locating her, anchoring her in that event. In the immediate context. The worth and value of the speaker is infused into the merits and value of the narrative for this audience. And they're all, I understand they were all her friends in this audience. So this actually creates then an heirloom-like quality to this particular narrative or this particular activity or event that the family passed on. It was theirs. Now, if we go on to the Melungeon case, we look at the next example, example 4, and Melungeon genealogical speaking practices, when you go to their reunions, are much more exploratory and informational based. They seem to be in accord with or conform to the kind of structuring that we see in the Scots-Irish, but they are supported, of course, by websites, listservs, email exchanges, an annual reunion or fast festival, books, academic and public articles, television and radio documentaries and interviews, academic lectures, private and public spontaneous talk. But the identifier Melungeon seems to be approaching the level of Scots-Irish until very recently, when a DNA study came out, and now things seem to be dying down quite a bit. But in terms of its valuation as an empowered, prestigious designator, That is, as an ethnonym, the case seems to be different. An example 4 represents a spontaneous example of kin talk offered by a middle-aged woman who was for a time certainly involved in advancing Melungeon, or attempting to advance Melungeon as a respectable identifier for a respectable group. Reared in rural southeastern Kentucky in a community I know well, Sarah relies on Southern Mountain English variety and on speaking practices typical of this area. This particular segment, then, is structurally iconic with one form of kin talk in southeastern Kentucky, and these kinds of kin talk must do two things in addition to giving the origin and the genealogy. They must place people. And to place individuals in this narrative in this part of the world, we situate individuals along two axes: the geographical locales, certain hollers, certain creek, or a certain community, and those hollers, creeks, and communities evoke historical events, memories, and ancestries among the locals, but they also place them in social networks that individuals belong in. Neither of these functions is overtly present in this segment, although Sarah had mentioned earlier in the conversation the importance of this place. That is, this segment reveals that Sarah does not, in local terms, belong to this place. That is, what the pronouns help do with us in the reference to place is they suggest that you are actually rooted in and respected by and identified with that place. The discussion of kin is couched in third person, topically organized around the common genealogical metaphor of a tree, and the airline-like valuation of an activity or object we saw in example 3 is absent here. Instead, the dominant function of this segment is to describe the acquisition of information about possible kin, not to reaffirm rights, to document a historically validated past in which ancestors participated agentively and effectively. The indisputable assertion of belonging into a place-based ancestry having a known origin and known genealogical links is simply not present. Therefore, Sarah cannot use kin talk in its various forms to value Melungeon as a means of access to empowering groups, networks, organizations, either in a manner consistent with local white Appalachian discourse or with the backcountry South Carolina practice in example 3. Nor can other Melungeons, without resorting to the use of possible white, often Scots-Irish systems of reckoning genealogy. Indeed, much of the genealogical and kinship talk at Melungeon reunions seeks this kind of information or poses just simple ways of life describing how their ancestors lived. Generally speaking, genealogical data is relatively shallow, going back only a few generations perhaps to before the Civil War. As a result, the identifier Melungeon cannot currently acquire the same valuation and the same entailments to empower discursive forms and practices as does Scotch-Irish.